Pay up or start washing dishes, my father-in-law chuckled, sliding the $4,000 restaurant bill toward me, as my mother-in-law smirked. The entire waitstaff stared, waiting for me to break down and cry. But I didn't reach for my purse. Instead, I signaled the head chef. Have you ever been pushed to your absolute breaking point by the very people who are supposed to be your family? Tell me your own story in the comments below, and please subscribe to our channel to hear mine. Because to understand how I ended up forcing my greedy in-laws to pawn their beloved jewelry to cover a dinner tab, we have to go back to where the silent resentment truly began. I have always believed that marriage is about joining two families, not just two individuals. I have always believed that marriage is about joining two families, not just two individuals. But after 5 years of being married to David, I often felt like an unpaid assistant rather than a cherished daughter-in-law. David is a good man, but he is painfully blind to his parents' flaws. To me, they are an exhausting storm of emotional neglect and financial demands. My father-in-law, Arthur, views every interaction as a transaction where he must come out on top. My mother-in-law, Martha, treats me less like a family member and more like a personal ATM with a pulse. Whenever we visit their pristine suburban home, the conversation inevitably steers toward money. Who bought what, who went on which luxury vacation, and, most importantly, what David and I should be buying for them. I endure their snide remarks about my modest wardrobe and my supposedly simple career. They think I am merely a freelance consultant struggling to make ends meet, riding on their son's coattails. They have never bothered to ask about my life or my passions, assuming my quiet demeanor equates to a lack of ambition. I never corrected them. Silence, I quickly learned, was the only shield I had against their endless greed. If I bought a nice handbag, Martha would demand one in a different color. If we bought a new car, Arthur would suddenly need a loan for home improvements that never happened. So I learned to shrink myself. I wore plain clothes around them, drove a reliable but aging sedan, and smiled politely through their condescending lectures. But beneath my quiet exterior, I was carrying a secret that was about to collide spectacularly with their insatiable greed. The truth was, I wasn't just a struggling consultant. 5 years ago, right before David and I got married, my beloved grandmother passed away and left me a modest inheritance. Instead of spending it, I poured every single penny into a crumbling, forgotten bistro in the heart of the city. I worked 18-hour days, hired a brilliant but unrecognized chef named Julian, and completely rebranded the space. We called it Lumiere. Today, Lumiere isn't just a restaurant, it is a culinary institution. We earned our first Michelin star 2 years ago, and getting a reservation requires a 3-month wait. I am the sole owner, but I operate entirely behind the scenes. I manage the finances, curate the overall vision, and let Julian shine in the spotlight. David knows about the restaurant, of course, but out of respect for my wishes, he agreed to keep it a secret from his parents. We both knew that if Arthur and Martha found out, they would exploit the staff, demand free meals daily, and ruin the sanctuary I had painstakingly built. I loved my hidden life. Stepping into the bustling, elegant kitchen of Lumiere was my escape from the heavy, suffocating expectations of my in-laws. There, I wasn't the disappointing daughter-in-law who couldn't afford designer shoes. I was Madam Owner, respected and cherished by a loyal team. But secrets, especially in families as intrusive as mine, have a funny way of demanding to be dragged into the light. The catalyst arrived in the form of Martha's upcoming 60th birthday. For weeks, she had been dropping impossibly heavy hints about wanting a milestone celebration that would make her friends green with envy. And unfortunately for me, her sights were set on Lumiere. The ambush happened on a chilly Tuesday evening during our mandatory weekly family dinner. David was out of town on a business trip, leaving me to face the lions alone. I sat quietly, pushing peas around my plate, as Martha loudly complained about her friends' lavish birthday parties. Susan's daughter-in-law took her to Paris, Martha sighed dramatically, resting her chin on her hand.
Of course, I don't expect anything grand like that from you, dear. I know you and David are on a strict budget. Arthur chuckled, a sound that always grated on my nerves. Well, Martha, we can't all have successful children, but I was reading about that new place downtown, Lumiere, supposed to be the best in the city. I think it's only fitting we go there for your mother's 60th.
He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with a challenging, greedy light. Since David is away, I expect you to make the arrangements. Consider it your gift to us. I froze. Arthur, getting a table there takes months, and it's quite expensive. Oh, please, Martha scoffed, rolling her eyes. If you really cared about us, you'd find a way. Call them, beg if you have to. Or are you saying I'm not worth a nice dinner? The sheer audacity of it took my breath away. They were demanding I pay for a 5-star meal, fully intending to exploit my supposed meager savings just to humiliate me. I looked at Arthur's smug smile and Martha's entitled glare.
I will handle the reservation. We will celebrate at Lumiere, Arthur smirked, unaware that he had just set his own trap.
I arrived at Lumiere early the next morning, long before the lunch service began. The familiar scent of simmering veal stock and roasting garlic was a comforting embrace. I walked straight past the pristine dining area and knocked on the door of the head chef's office. Julian looked up from his supplier invoices, surprised to see me during the daylight hours. I quickly explained the situation, keeping the familial drama to a minimum, but making it very clear that I was bringing some highly difficult guests for Saturday night. I told him I needed a private table, the absolute best VIP treatment, but under no circumstances was anyone on the staff to address me as the owner until I explicitly gave the signal. Julian, bless him, just nodded, a knowing twinkle in his weary eyes. He had cooked for enough demanding, entitled customers to understand the delicate dance of ego and etiquette. Throughout the week, my phone buzzed incessantly with text messages from Martha. She dictated the dress code I was expected to follow, reminded me of her severe allergies to anything cheap, and constantly demanded confirmation that the reservation was actually secured. I replied with brief, polite affirmations, swallowing my rising irritation. David called me that Thursday night from his hotel across the country, apologizing profusely for leaving me to deal with his parents alone. "Just survive the dinner," he sighed through the receiver. "I'll make it up to you, I promise." I assured him everything was fine, feeling a brief, sharp twinge of guilt for not telling him my plan. But this was no longer just about surviving a dinner. It was about drawing a permanent boundary with Arthur and Martha. I was setting the stage. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, relentless downpour, perfectly mirroring the deep dread I usually felt when spending any extended time with my in-laws. I pulled my reliable, aging sedan up to the valet stand at Lumiere, feeling a familiar, secret thrill of pride at the sight of the gleaming brass doors and the warmly glowing sign. Arthur and Martha had insisted on driving separately in their pristine leased Mercedes. I found them waiting in the lavish, dimly lit lobby, Martha practically vibrating with a toxic mix of excitement and disdain. She was heavily draped in flashy costume jewelry she loved to pass off as real diamonds to her bridge club. "Well, finally," Martha huffed, eyeing my simple, understated black dress from head to toe. "I see you didn't bother to dress up for my milestone. I hope they even let you in wearing that. At least the venue looks decent." Arthur confidently marched up to the maitre d', who stood tall and perfectly polite, despite my father-in-law's aggressively arrogant tone.
"Reservation for Arthur?" he barked, tapping his credit card on the podium. I stepped forward quickly, smoothly intercepting the interaction. "Actually, the reservation is under my name." Arthur shot me a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, but dutifully followed the hostess. As we walked through the opulent dining room, I watched Martha's eyes widen slightly at the cascading crystal chandeliers and the hushed, elegant atmosphere.
But true to her nature, she immediately found something to complain about. The lighting is far too dim, and I pray the portions aren't those tiny, pretentious dots of food, she whispered loudly. I simply smiled, leading them to a secluded alcove with a perfect view of the open kitchen. The trap was beautifully set. The moment we sat down, Arthur seized the heavy, leather-bound menu like it was a weapon drawn in battle. I watched his eyes dart immediately to the prices on the right side of the page, completely ignoring the descriptions of the food. A slow, deeply greedy smile spread across his wrinkled face. "Since you insisted on treating us tonight," Arthur said smoothly, completely rewriting the history of our Tuesday dinner, "we really shouldn't hold back. It's a very special occasion, after all." Without waiting for my input, he loudly ordered the grand tasting menu, complete with the premium vintage wine pairing, A5 Wagyu beef, and seasonal white truffles shaved tableside.
Martha eagerly chimed in, demanding an extra appetizer of beluga caviar just to be safe. Our waiter, Antoine, took their extravagant orders with flawless, practiced professionalism, briefly catching my eye before bowing slightly and walking away. Over the next 2 hours, the absolute finest culinary creations Lumiere had to offer were paraded to our table. Julian had truly outdone himself.
The food was breathtakingly exquisite, yet Arthur and Martha chewed every bite with an air of profound manufactured disappointment. "The Wagyu is a bit too fatty, don't you think?" Martha complained loudly, right after aggressively scraping her plate completely clean. Arthur scoffed at the perfectly aged Bordeaux, swirling it violently in his crystal glass. "I've had much better at the country club. Honestly, I don't see what the big fuss is about. Every critique was meant to humiliate me, to highlight my supposed inability to provide a truly luxurious experience. They were happily gorging themselves on a $4,000 meal, savoring the cruel fact that I would be left to foot the massive bill."
I sat in absolute silence, drinking my sparkling water, waiting for the climax. The final plates of delicately spun sugar and gold leaf-dusted chocolate soufflé were cleared away. Aunt Beatrice, Martha's equally entitled sister who had brazenly invited herself to our table halfway through the main course, just to drain the expensive vintage Bordeaux, let out a satisfied, unbothered sigh. I watched as Antoine placed the sleek black leather billfold gently on the center of the table. The total, I knew without looking, was exactly $4,000. Arthur leaned back in his plush chair, patting his stomach with exaggerated satisfaction. He reached into his suit jacket, then paused. His face fell into a mask of perfectly rehearsed shock. He patted his pants pockets, his movements dramatically frantic. "Martha," he gasped, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. "My wallet! I think I left it in my other coat." Martha gasped, clutching her fake pearls. She frantically dug through her designer knockoff purse, throwing her hands up in theatrical despair. "Oh no, Arthur, I completely forgot to bring my clutch from the car." "I only have my lipstick." Aunt Beatrice merely shrugged, taking another sip of my sparkling water. "Don't look at me. I only came for the company and the wine. I didn't bring a dime." It was a terrible, unconvincing performance. They hadn't forgotten anything. This was the grand finale of their cruel little game. They had orchestrated this entire lavish feast with the sole intention of sticking me with a bill they firmly believed would ruin me financially. They wanted to punish me for not being the wealthy daughter-in-law they felt they deserved. I stared at them, the rain from the relentless downpour outside hitting the large window pane next to us, sending distorted, mesmerizing ripples of amber streetlights across our table. I didn't reach for my purse. I just sat there, letting the heavy, judgmental silence stretch between us. The silence at our table stretched, thick and suffocating. A few patrons at nearby tables glanced over, drawn by Martha's loud, theatrical sighs of distress and the sudden tension radiating from our corner.
Arthur picked up the leather folder, opened it, and let out a low, exaggerated whistle at the steep total.
He slid it across the white linen tablecloth until it firmly bumped against my water glass. "Well, this is quite the predicament," Arthur chuckled, leaning forward with a cold, predatory gleam in his eyes. He dropped the act of the embarrassed father-in-law completely, revealing the sheer malice underneath. "It seems we are completely out of funds."
"And since you are the one who wanted to eat here, you better pay up." "I told you this place was far too expensive, Arthur," Martha chimed in, crossing her arms smugly and glaring at me. "But she insisted. She wanted to show off for my birthday, and now she can deal with the consequences." I looked at the exorbitant bill, then back at their smug faces.
"You ordered the most expensive items on the menu. All of you. You specifically asked for the white truffles." "And you arranged it," Arthur sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "So pay up, or start washing dishes." He chuckled again, a cruel, satisfied sound that made my skin crawl. "I'm sure they have plenty of greasy pots in the back for a struggling consultant to scrub."
Antoine stood a few feet away, his face perfectly neutral, but I could feel the professional outrage radiating from him. The surrounding waitstaff were beginning to stare, sensing the escalating conflict. Arthur, Martha, and Beatrice looked at me expectantly, waiting for the tears, the panic, the desperate pleading. They were waiting for me to break. Instead, I calmly picked up my cloth napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate.
I didn't reach for my purse. I didn't flinch, cry, or look away from Arthur's mocking, victorious gaze. The panic they so desperately wanted to see simply wasn't there. Instead, I calmly raised my right hand and caught Antoine's eye. I gave him a curt, almost imperceptible nod, the absolute signal we had agreed upon earlier that morning.
Antoine's posture instantly straightened from attentive waiter to fiercely loyal employee. He quickly stepped over to the open kitchen line and whispered something urgently to the expediter. Within seconds, the heavy double doors of the kitchen swung wide open. Julian, our renowned and fiercely private head chef, stepped out into the dining room.
He was still wearing his pristine white chef's coat, wiping his hands on a pristine side towel. The low murmur of the dining room quieted down significantly as patrons recognized the culinary genius behind their expensive meals. Julian bypassed the other high-profile tables and walked directly with purpose to our alcove.
Arthur puffed out his chest, completely misreading the severity of the situation. "Ah, the chef! Excellent meal, my good man, but we are having a slight financial disagreement with our guest here." Julian completely ignored Arthur's outstretched hand. He stopped right beside my chair, bowed deeply and respectfully, and clasped his hands behind his back.
The entire waitstaff in the vicinity stopped what they were doing, turning their full attention to us. "Is everything to your liking, Madam Owner?" Julian asked, his voice clear, booming, and ringing out in the hushed dining room. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. I slowly looked at Arthur, Martha, and Beatrice.
The smug, victorious smiles had been instantly wiped from their faces, replaced by an ashen, horrified pallor. They looked as if all the blood had been violently drained from their bodies. I leaned forward, looking into my in-laws' pale faces, my voice steady and icy cold. "Wash the dishes? No, but you three will." Martha's jaw practically unhinged, her heavily glossed lips parting in a silent, comical, fish-like gasp. Arthur sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of magenta as his brain desperately tried to process Julian's words. He looked from the towering, world-renowned chef to my calm, unyielding expression, searching for a punchline that simply did not exist. "Madam Owner?"
"Arthur!" finally choked out, his voice trembling and devoid of its usual booming arrogance. This is a joke. You're a freelance consultant. You drive a beat-up sedan. I manage the consulting firm that oversees this restaurant's finances, Arthur, I replied softly, though my voice carried easily in the quiet dining room. Because I own it.
I bought this building 5 years ago with my grandmother's inheritance. While you were mocking my simple clothes and demanding I fund your home improvements, I was building a Michelin-starred empire. Aunt Beatrice suddenly looked absolutely terrified. She abruptly stopped reaching for the last piece of chocolate soufflé and shrank back into the plush upholstery. Martha, however, attempted to salvage her shattered pride through sheer denial. She let out a high, nervous laugh. "Well, what a wonderful surprise!" Martha practically squeaked, her hands fluttering anxiously. "To think my own daughter-in-law owns Lumiere! Why didn't you tell us? We could have been eating here for free every week." I stared at her, marveling at the boundless depths of her entitlement. Even in the face of her own humiliating exposure, her first instinct was to figure out how to exploit me. But the days of my silent compliance were officially over. I leaned forward, my eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the polite facade I had worn for 5 long years. "Because," I said slowly, "this restaurant is my sanctuary, and I knew you would try to bleed it dry." The brutal honesty of my words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of the truffles they had just devoured. Antoine and the rest of the staff watched with quiet, dignified satisfaction. Arthur, finally realizing the absolute lack of leverage he possessed, tried a different tactic: righteous indignation. "You set us up," he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You let us order all this expensive food just to humiliate us." "I didn't force you to order a $4,000 meal, Arthur," I countered, my tone flat. "You ordered it with the sole intention of forcing me to pay for it. You orchestrated a fake crisis to bankrupt your own daughter-in-law. I simply let your greed run its natural course." I gestured to the leather billfold resting on the table. "Now, about the bill. I was joking about the dishes. I wouldn't let you near Julian's pristine kitchen. But as a business owner, I cannot simply write off $4,000 of premium inventory because you forgot your wallets." Arthur swallowed hard, the reality of his situation setting in. He was trapped. I can call a friend," he mumbled, reaching for his phone. "No need," I said smoothly. "I will accept collateral until you return with the cash tomorrow morning. Arthur, your prized Rolex watch. Martha, those diamond earrings you love to flaunt. Leave them here with my manager, and you are free to go." The sheer indignity of having to pawn their beloved status symbols in a 5-star restaurant nearly broke them. Trembling with humiliation, Arthur unclasped his heavy gold watch, and Martha silently unhooked her earrings. They placed the items on the table, their faces flushed with absolute shame. They stood up and walked out of the restaurant without a single word, leaving the echoes of their broken pride behind. The heavy rain had stopped by the time David returned home from his business trip on Sunday afternoon. He found me sitting on the living room sofa, staring quietly out the window, a cup of warm tea resting in my hands. The heavy burden I had carried for 5 years felt entirely lifted, replaced by a strange, peaceful clarity. David dropped his bags in the hallway, instantly sensing the shifted atmosphere. He walked over and sat beside me, his brow furrowed in concern. "I missed you," he said gently, kissing my forehead. "How was the birthday dinner? Did my parents behave?" I turned to him, took a deep breath, and told him everything. I spared no details. I told him about the Tuesday ambush, the lavish demands, the forgotten wallets, and the cruel ultimatum they had delivered. Finally, I told him how I had signaled Julian and forced them to leave their jewelry as collateral to cover the exorbitant bill. David sat in stunned silence. The color drained from his face as he processed the sheer malice of his parents' actions. For years, he had made excuses for them, calling them traditional or set in their ways. But there was no excusing an intentional, malicious plot to financially ruin his wife for sport. I can't believe they would do that, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at me, truly seeing the emotional toll his blindness had taken on my spirit. They tried to scam you, to break you. They did try, I agreed softly, reaching out to hold his hand. But they failed. David, I love you, but I will never be their victim again. David squeezed my hand tightly, a new resolve hardening in his eyes. You won't have to be. I am so sorry I let it get this far. I'm calling them right now. David did not storm out or yell. His anger was much quieter and far more profound. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed his father's number, and placed it on the coffee table on speakerphone. It only rang twice before Arthur answered, his voice immediately booming with manufactured outrage. "David, finally!" Arthur barked. "Your wife completely humiliated us last night. She forced us to leave our valuables at some pretentious restaurant over a simple misunderstanding. You need to discipline her and get my watch back immediately." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "There was no misunderstanding, Dad. She told me everything. You ordered the most expensive items on the menu and then pretended to forget your wallets to stick her with a $4,000 bill. We are your parents," Martha wailed in the background, her voice thick with fake tears. "We gave you everything, and she treated us like common criminals. She should be grateful to treat us." "Grateful?" David's voice dropped an octave, laced with a cold disappointment I had never heard before. "You tried to financially ruin my wife because you were jealous and greedy. You used my absence to ambush her. You don't get to play the victim here." There was a heavy, stunned silence on the other end of the line. They had expected David to take their side, to soothe their bruised egos as he always had. "Listen to me carefully," David continued, his tone absolutely unyielding. "You are going to take the cash to Lumiere tomorrow morning, pay your bill, and retrieve your things. And until you can offer my wife a sincere apology, do not expect us at Sunday dinners. Do not expect us at all." He ended the call, leaving a profound, healing silence in our living room. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, clear sky, washing away the weekend's heavy rain. I sat in my private office at Lumiere, reviewing the supplier invoices with a renewed sense of peace. At exactly 10 o'clock, my general manager knocked softly on the door, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Madam," he said politely, "your guests from Saturday night are in the lobby. They have an envelope." I smoothed down my simple gray skirt and walked out to the front of house. Arthur and Martha stood awkwardly by the hostess stand, completely stripped of their usual pompous arrogance. Without the shield of their status symbols and their perceived authority over me, they looked remarkably small and deeply exhausted. Arthur avoided my gaze entirely. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick white envelope, sliding it across the polished mahogany counter. 4,000, he muttered, his jaw tight with barely suppressed resentment. "Count it if you must." I did. I opened the envelope and meticulously counted the crisp $100 bills, right in front of them, letting the agonizing seconds tick by. When I was satisfied, I nodded to my manager, who retrieved the heavy gold Rolex and the diamond earrings from the secure safe. Martha practically snatched the earrings from the counter, clutching them to her chest as if I might change my mind. Arthur strapped his watch back onto his wrist, his face flushed. "Are we done here?" he asked bitterly. "We are," I replied, my voice calm and completely detached. "The bill is settled. However, you are no longer welcome at this establishment. Our future interactions will be strictly on my terms. Have a good day." I turned my back and walked away, leaving them standing in the lobby they had so desperately wanted to conquer. The weeks that followed were strange, quiet, and incredibly healing.
For the first time in 5 years, my phone did not buzz with Martha's passive-aggressive text messages demanding favors. Tuesday evenings, once a source of intense dread and anxiety, transformed into cozy, intimate dinners at home with David. The silence was golden, yet occasionally it carried a faint, lingering ache of grief.
I mourned the family dynamic I had desperately hoped for when I married David. I had wanted a second set of parents to love and respect, not adversaries I had to constantly defend myself against. I had wanted warm holiday gatherings, not a battlefield of egos and entitlement. Acknowledging that reality was painful, but it was far better than living a lie.
The greatest shift, however, occurred within my marriage. David stopped making excuses for his parents' behavior. The veil had been lifted, and he finally saw the emotional burden I had carried in silence. He started visiting Lumiere during his lunch breaks, sitting at the chef's counter and watching me in my element. He saw the respect I commanded, the business I had meticulously built, and the sanctuary I had protected. One evening, as we sat on the sofa watching a movie, he pulled me close and kissed the top of my head. "I'm so sorry I was blind for so long," he whispered gently. "I should have protected you from the start. I am so incredibly proud of you and of what you've built."
"We are protecting each other now," I replied, resting my head against his chest. Our marriage was healing, growing stronger in the aftermath of the storm. But the bridge with Arthur and Martha remained severely fractured, waiting for a true test of their supposed remorse.
Autumn arrived rapidly, bringing with it the first major holiday since the disastrous birthday dinner. Traditionally, Thanksgiving was a chaotic, exhausting marathon. I would spend 2 agonizing days cooking in their cramped kitchen, while Martha aggressively critiqued my seasoning, and Arthur loudly complained about the volume of the football game on television. This year, however, David and I decided to host a small, quiet dinner at our own home, inviting only a few close, supportive friends. Despite the warm laughter filling our dining room, the absence of his parents was a heavy, unspoken presence. As I carved the roasted turkey, I caught David staring at his phone, his thumb hovering anxiously over his father's contact name. He didn't make the call. He slipped the device back into his pocket with a soft, defeated sigh. I knew it hurt him immensely. Setting boundaries is often romanticized as an empowering, triumphant act, but the reality is much colder. It feels like grief. It is the painful amputation of a toxic limb to save the rest of the body. Later that evening, after our guests had left, David helped me wash the delicate wine glasses.
"Do you think they miss us?" he asked quietly, handing me a dried plate. I paused, the warm, soapy water coating my hands. "I think they miss the convenience of us," I replied honestly, not wanting to offer false comfort. "I don't know if they miss us yet. They have to let go of their pride first, and that takes time." David nodded slowly, wrapping his arms securely around my waist from behind.
We were a united front, but the quiet house echoed with the fractured reality of our family. The suffocating silence stretched deep into December, thick and unresolved. Then an unexpected catalyst shifted the stagnant dynamic. I was reviewing the new winter holiday menu with Julian in his office when my phone buzzed incessantly. It was David, and he sounded uncharacteristically shaken, his breath hitching slightly. "My dad is in the hospital," he said, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "It's not life-threatening, a severe, sudden panic attack that mimicked a heart issue, but he's incredibly rattled. Martha is a complete wreck. They need us." Despite the anger I still harbored, a sharp pang of profound empathy pierced my chest. We rushed to the city hospital, finding Martha sitting alone in the harsh, sterile waiting room. She looked utterly deflated, entirely stripped of her heavy costume jewelry and her haughty demeanor. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and she looked her age, a frightened, overwhelmed woman clinging desperately to a crumpled tissue. When she saw us approaching, she didn't demand answers or throw a theatrical tantrum. Instead, she stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and simply crumpled into David's arms, sobbing uncontrollably into his shoulder. I stood a few feet away, giving them the necessary space.
For the first time, I saw Martha not as an antagonist, but as a deeply insecure person whose carefully constructed world had suddenly cracked. When she finally pulled away from David, she looked directly at me. There was no icy glare, no snide remark. She just offered a weak, trembling nod of acknowledgement. He just collapsed in the kitchen, she whispered to me, her voice completely devoid of its usual venom. I didn't know who else to call. In that brief, fragile moment, the impenetrable armor of their pride showed a tiny, significant fracture. Arthur's sudden health scare forced a brutal, unavoidable reckoning within their quiet suburban household. The visceral fear of mortality has a unique, absolute way of shrinking inflated egos. A few days after he was officially discharged, a handwritten letter arrived in our mailbox, addressed to both David and me. It wasn't written on Martha's usual monogrammed, heavily perfumed stationery, but on plain, simple lined notebook paper. The handwriting was shaky, but it was unmistakably Arthur's. "I am a proud man, often to a massive fault," the letter began abruptly. Laying in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized that my stubborn pride has cost me my only son. I was entirely wrong to treat you the way I did at the restaurant. It was petty, cruel, and unworthy of a father. I let my deep jealousy of your massive success poison my judgment. The words were a stark, jarring departure from the arrogant, mocking man who had maliciously ordered me to wash dishes in front of an entire restaurant. I sat at the kitchen island, silently tracing the jagged ink letters with my index finger. It wasn't a completely perfect apology. There was still a faint hint of defensiveness in his phrasing, but it was a massive, unprecedented leap. David sat across from me, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief as he read over the letter a second time. "He actually wrote it down," David murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "He admitted he was jealous of you." I looked at my husband, seeing a fragile, beautiful glimmer of hope returning to his tired eyes. The bridge between our families was still severely broken, but for the first time in 5 long years, someone had willingly laid down a plank to start rebuilding it. Forgiveness is rarely a sudden, cinematic event. It does not wash away years of deeply ingrained disrespect in a single sweeping tide. As I held Arthur's handwritten letter, I felt a genuine spark of hope, but I also felt a profound need to protect the peace David and I had finally established. We spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, dissecting every word of the apology and discussing what our next move should be. "We can't just go back to the way things were," I said gently, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. "I appreciate his honesty, I truly do. But if we immediately reinstate the weekly dinners and the unchecked access to our lives, they might slip right back into their old habits. We need to set a totally new precedent." David completely agreed. The blinders were off, and he was fiercely protective of our marriage. He called his parents the following afternoon, his tone calm but absolutely firm. He thanked his father for the letter, acknowledging the difficulty it must have taken to write it. Then he proposed a compromise. We would not be going to their house for the holidays, nor would we invite them to ours just yet. Instead, we offered to meet them on entirely neutral ground, a quiet, unassuming little cafe halfway between our home and theirs. There would be no lavish meals, no expensive wine, and no opportunities to hide behind the armor of a high society setting. It would just be the 4 of us, 2 cups of tea, and the unfiltered truth. Martha hesitated over the phone, perhaps missing the comfort of her home turf, but Arthur quickly accepted the terms. The stage was set for a very different kind of meeting. The cafe we chose was a modest, dimly lit space filled with the comforting aroma of roasted beans and old paperbacks. I arrived with David exactly on time, my stomach tying itself into nervous, familiar knots. We found Arthur and Martha already seated at a small corner table. The transformation in their physical appearance was staggering. Without the grand backdrop of a five-star restaurant or the pristine walls of their suburban home, they looked remarkably ordinary, fragile, and distinctly older. Arthur wore a simple gray sweater, his prized gold Rolex conspicuously absent from his wrist. Martha sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, devoid of any flashy costume jewelry. As we sat down, a heavy, tentative silence enveloped the table. Nobody reached for a menu. Arthur cleared his throat, his eyes fixed firmly on his plain black coffee. I want to reiterate what I wrote," he began, his voice lacking its usual booming resonance. "I am profoundly sorry. I let my ego dictate my actions. I wanted to put you in your place because your quiet success made me feel incredibly small." Hearing the words spoken aloud, stripped of any defensive posturing, carried an immense emotional weight. Martha reached out and gently touched my arm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We were incredibly foolish," she whispered softly. "We alienated the only family we have over foolish pride and petty jealousy. Please, we just want our son back, and we want to learn how to be a real family to you." I looked at David, seeing the quiet relief washing over his face, and then I looked back at my in-laws. I didn't offer a sweeping, magical pardon. "I accept your apology," I said steadily, "but trust will take time to rebuild." The cafe meeting marked the absolute end of the Cold War, but it was only the very beginning of a long, delicate reconstruction phase. We entered a strict trial period, establishing a completely new paradigm for our relationship. The unspoken rules of our dynamic had been entirely rewritten. There were no more demanding Tuesday dinners. Instead, we met once a month for a simple Sunday brunch at a casual diner, explicitly splitting the bill right down the middle. At first, the conversations were agonizingly stilted. Arthur and Martha walked on eggshells, terrified of saying the wrong thing and accidentally triggering another complete estrangement. But slowly, the thick layer of tension began to dissipate. Without the constant, exhausting pressure to prove their financial superiority, they actually started to ask genuine questions about our lives. One Sunday, as we shared a plate of ordinary pancakes, Arthur asked me about Lumiere. Not about its profit margins, the Michelin star, or the wealthy clientele, but about the day-to-day operations. "Julian is incredibly talented," I told them, keeping my tone carefully measured. "We are working on sourcing more ingredients from local, sustainable farms for the spring menu. It's challenging, but very fulfilling." To my absolute surprise, Arthur simply nodded, a look of genuine respect crossing his lined face. "Running a business of that caliber requires immense dedication," he said softly. "You've built something truly remarkable from the ground up. I deeply admire your work ethic." I nearly dropped my fork. It was the very first genuine compliment he had ever given me in over 5 years of marriage. It wasn't completely perfect. There was still a vast ocean of emotional distance between us, but it was a solid, undeniable foundation. The greedy monsters from the birthday dinner were gone, replaced by deeply flawed, humbling human beings trying to learn how to love. The gradual thawing of our relationship didn't happen overnight. It was a series of microscopic, deliberate choices. The most profound shift came from Martha. Stripped of her competitive need to outshine her bridge club friends, she seemed entirely lost at first. Her identity had been so heavily wrapped up in projecting wealth and status. One Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. Seeing Martha's name on the caller ID still sent a brief, involuntary spike of anxiety through my chest, a lingering ghost of the past, but I answered it. "I was wondering," Martha began, her voice hesitant and completely devoid of its old demanding tone, "if you might have a free afternoon this weekend. I want to learn how to make that lemon herb roast chicken you made for David's birthday a few years ago. I've been trying to cook more at home, and mine always turns out terribly dry. I was genuinely speechless. The Martha of 5 years ago would have never admitted to a culinary failure, let alone asked her simple daughter-in-law for guidance.
It was an olive branch extended with remarkable vulnerability. That Saturday, we stood side by side in her surprisingly modest kitchen. There was no talk of designer bags or luxury vacations. Instead, we focused entirely on the rhythm of chopping herbs, zesting lemons, and trussing the chicken. I showed her how to mix the butter under the skin to keep the meat incredibly moist.
As the savory, comforting aroma filled her home, I realized we were doing much more than cooking a meal. We were meticulously, quietly, rebuilding the very foundation of our relationship, replacing the toxic currency of money with the genuine warmth of shared, humble experiences.
Throughout this delicate rebuilding phase, David remained the steadfast guardian of our boundaries. He never once pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with, nor did he allow his parents to slip past the invisible lines we had firmly drawn. If Arthur made a slightly insensitive comment out of old habits, David would immediately, gently correct him. He was no longer the passive son trying to keep the peace at the expense of his wife's mental health. He was a fiercely protective husband. This new dynamic brought an incredible, profound peace to our marriage. The emotional energy I had previously spent bracing myself for my in-laws' relentless attacks was now entirely redirected into my life, my husband, and my restaurant. Lumiere continued to thrive under Julian's brilliant direction, but my own need to hide behind it slowly evaporated. I didn't need the secret identity of Madam Owner to feel powerful anymore, because my real life finally felt safe and deeply respected. There were still moments of grief, of course.
Sometimes watching other families effortlessly navigate the holidays without rigid boundaries and scheduled neutral ground meetings made my chest ache with a quiet sorrow. I mourned the effortless, unconditionally loving in-laws I had once dreamed of having.
But as I watched David laugh easily on the phone with his father one evening, his shoulders relaxed and free from the heavy burden of keeping up appearances, I realized that the family we were actively building now, flawed, recovering, and brutally honest, was far more valuable than the toxic illusion we had left behind. The true measure of our progress arrived in late spring, marking my 32nd birthday. In the grueling years prior, my birthdays were either completely ignored by Arthur and Martha or aggressively hijacked to celebrate one of their own minor milestones. I expected nothing more than a polite text message or a generic store-bought card in the mail. Instead, David received a very cautious phone call from his father. They wanted to invite us over for dinner. Not to a restaurant, and certainly not to Lumiere. They explicitly stated they wanted to host us quietly at their home. When we arrived, the pristine suburban house felt entirely different. The stifling air of pretense was completely gone. The dining room table wasn't set with the intimidating crystal goblets or the expensive silver meant to impress. It was set with their everyday, practical plates. Martha emerged from the kitchen carrying a slightly lopsided homemade chocolate cake. It wasn't a towering, professionally baked masterpiece. The frosting was a little uneven and it leaned slightly to the left. But as she set it carefully on the table, her eyes met mine with a deeply genuine, hopeful smile. "We know it's not much," Arthur said quietly, pulling out my chair for me with a gentle, respectful nod. "But Martha made it herself, from scratch. We just wanted to celebrate you and to thank you for giving us a second chance." I looked at the simple, imperfect cake, and a wave of raw, overwhelming emotion washed over me. It was the most beautiful thing they had ever given me. I smiled, feeling the last remaining shards of ice in my heart finally melt away. "It's absolutely perfect," I whispered softly. After we finished the lopsided chocolate cake, David went into the kitchen to help Martha wash the dishes. I stayed behind in the dining room, nursing a cup of black coffee opposite Arthur. The comfortable silence between us was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension that used to define our interactions. He stared at his empty dessert plate for a long time before finally looking up, his eyes weary but incredibly clear. "You know," Arthur began, his voice barely above a whisper, "when I first met you, I thought you were weak because you were quiet. I thought you lacked ambition." He paused, intertwining his weathered fingers on the table. "The truth is, I was terrified of what I didn't understand. I spent my entire life equating loud arrogance with success. When you quietly outpaced me in every single metric of real achievement, it shattered my fragile worldview." I listened without interrupting. This was not a forced apology or a defensive justification. It was a profound, unvarnished confession from a deeply flawed man trying to heal. "I projected all my own deep-seated financial insecurities onto you," he continued, his gaze steady. "I tried to break you at that restaurant because I desperately needed to feel powerful again. It is the greatest regret of my twilight years." "Arthur," I said softly, reaching across the table to gently touch his arm. "You don't have to carry that weight anymore. We have moved past that night. You are showing me who you are now, and that is all that matters." A single tear slipped down Arthur's cheek, which he quickly brushed away with the back of his hand. In that quiet, vulnerable moment, the intimidating father-in-law was entirely gone, replaced by a father seeking grace. The true test of their transformation occurred a few weeks later. Aunt Beatrice, who had been conspicuously absent since the disastrous incident at Lumiere, suddenly arrived at Arthur and Martha's house unannounced during one of our Sunday visits. She breezed through the front door, draped in heavy perfume and her usual air of toxic superiority, entirely unaware that the household dynamics had fundamentally shifted. She immediately scowled when she saw David and me sitting comfortably on the living room sofa, sharing a bowl of plain popcorn instead of indulging in expensive charcuterie. "Well, this is quite the downgrade," Beatrice sneered, tossing her designer knockoff coat onto an armchair. She looked pointedly at me. "I suppose since the secret is out, you don't feel the need to pretend to be part of the family anymore. Are you hoarding all your restaurant money, dear? Or are you finally going to treat your poor in-laws to a proper vacation?" The old me would have shrunk into the cushions, waiting for Arthur or Martha to join in on the cruel banter. But the room remained dead silent. I didn't even have to say a word. Martha stood up, her face flushed but her posture absolutely rigid with newfound conviction. "Beatrice, that is quite enough," she said, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You will not speak to my daughter-in-law that way in this house. She owes us absolutely nothing. If you cannot be respectful, you can take your coat and leave immediately." Beatrice gaped, looking utterly betrayed by her own sister. She sputtered, trying to find an ally in Arthur, but he simply pointed a stern finger toward the front door, silently seconding his wife's demand. Beatrice huffed indignantly and stormed out. I looked at Martha, profoundly, deeply moved. She had finally chosen me over her pride. The seasons turned, bringing a vibrant, blooming summer to the city. My relationship with my in-laws was no longer a fragile truce. It had blossomed into a genuine, functional family dynamic built on mutual respect and strict, healthy boundaries. We still had occasional misunderstandings, but they were resolved with calm conversations rather than malicious traps. It was during a warm Tuesday evening that I decided to bridge the final, lingering gap between our past and our present. I called Arthur and Martha, asking them to meet me downtown the following morning. I didn't specify the location, only providing an address. When their practical sedan pulled up to the curb, they looked visibly confused to see the familiar brass doors of Lumiere. The restaurant was closed to the public at this early hour, the closed sign hanging prominently in the window. Martha hesitated on the sidewalk, looking at the building with a mixture of awe and residual shame. "We promised we wouldn't intrude on your business," Arthur said softly, taking a step back. "We respect your sanctuary." I smiled, walking down the shallow steps to meet them.
"I know you do," I replied gently, "and that is exactly why you are welcome here today. Not as demanding clients and not as adversaries. I want to show you my world, as family." I unlocked the heavy front door and held it open. The dining room was quiet, bathed in soft morning sunlight. The ghosts of that terrible birthday dinner had been entirely exorcised.
Arthur and Martha stepped inside, their eyes wide, not with greed, but with quiet, respectful admiration. I led them toward the kitchen, ready to introduce them to Julian and the incredible team I loved, finally allowing my two worlds to beautifully, safely collide. I led them past the empty, sunlit dining tables, the polished hardwood floors echoing softly under our footsteps. I pushed open the heavy, swinging double doors to the kitchen, and the atmosphere instantly shifted. The morning prep was already in full, vibrant swing. The air was thick and intoxicating, heavy with the scent of fresh, sweet basil, simmering vegetable broth, and bread baking in the massive stone ovens. Julian looked up from his butcher block, meticulously wiping his hands on a pristine side towel. I saw a brief flicker of surprise cross his features when he recognized the couple from that fateful rainy night, but it was quickly replaced by a warm, completely professional nod. Antoine, who was polishing silver near the pass, paused and offered a polite, knowing smile. "Julian, team," I said, my voice steady and proud. "I would like to formally introduce my husband's parents, Arthur and Martha." Arthur stepped forward, taking off his flat cap. He didn't puff out his chest, didn't raise his voice to command attention, and didn't demand VIP treatment. He simply extended a weathered hand. "It is a profound honor to meet the genius behind this establishment," Arthur said, his voice laced with absolute, genuine humility. I must also formally apologize for our inexcusable behavior last year. We were foolish, and we deeply disrespected the incredible artistry that happens in this very room." Julian paused, setting down his knife, and accepted the handshake with a gracious, forgiving smile. "Apology accepted, sir. We all have moments in life we wish we could rewrite." Martha looked around the gleaming stainless steel countertops. "It takes so much discipline," she murmured to me. "You manage all of this? I finally understand the weight you carry." Instead of seating them at the opulent, dimly lit VIP alcove where our relationship had violently ruptured months ago, I led them to the small, intimate chef's table located right inside the bustling kitchen. It was a simple metal table where Julian and I usually tested new seasonal recipes, far away from the glittering chandeliers, plush upholstery, and expensive crystal glasses. "Since we are here as family today, we are going to eat like family," I explained gently, pulling out a sturdy metal stool for Martha. Julian did not bring out the A5 Wagyu beef, nor did he shave seasonal white truffles over gold leaf plates. Instead, he presented us with a rustic, beautifully fragrant cast-iron skillet of baked shakshuka, the eggs perfectly poached in the rich sauce, accompanied by thick, steaming slices of crusty sourdough bread straight from the oven. There was no extravagant vintage wine pairing to critique. Antoine simply brought over a pitcher of freshly squeezed orange juice and poured us mugs of hot, strong coffee. We sat around the small table, naturally tearing off pieces of bread and dipping them into the rich, perfectly spiced tomato and pepper sauce. Nobody complained about the portion sizes or the lack of luxury. We simply ate together, the clinking of our forks harmonizing with the rhythmic, comforting sounds of the kitchen prep around us. "This is absolutely incredible," Arthur sighed, closing his eyes to truly savor the hearty flavor. "Better than any fancy, overpriced tasting menu I've ever had." Martha nodded in quiet agreement, wiping her mouth with a simple paper napkin. "It just tastes like home." The heavy, oppressive ghost of the $4,000 bill had officially been laid to rest.
As I stood on the sunny sidewalk watching Arthur and Martha carefully back their modest sedan out of the loading zone, David walked up behind me. He wrapped his arms securely around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder, as we watched his parents' car merge into the busy morning city traffic.
The air felt lighter, completely devoid of the suffocating dread that used to accompany any interaction with them. "He actually survived the kitchen," he chuckled softly, pressing a gentle kiss to my cheek. "They did much more than survive," I smiled, leaning back into his warm embrace. "They understood. They finally saw the real me."
Looking back at the grueling landscape of the past 5 years, the journey feels incredibly surreal. I had endured silent, agonizing humiliation, harbored a massive financial secret, and eventually orchestrated a deeply explosive confrontation that shattered our fragile family dynamic into a million jagged pieces. But sometimes utter destruction is a necessary prerequisite for genuine creation.
If I had never let Arthur and Martha trap themselves in their own wicked web of greed over that $4,000 bill, we never would have reached this peaceful shore. Lumiere will always remain my cherished sanctuary, but I no longer need its walls to hide from my in-laws.
I don't have to purposefully shrink my life to make them comfortable, and they no longer feel the desperate need to inflate their egos to feel worthy of our love. The strict boundaries we firmly established saved us from entirely destroying each other.
The road to our reconciliation was heavily paved with tears, pawned jewelry, and intensely painful truths, but it successfully led us to a place of genuine, unconditional family love.